The Urbanist is brought to you in association with the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is a beacon of hope and inspiration. A catalyst to spark growth and collaboration with museums and experiences, where art and science and nature and technology coexist.
The belief of Abu Dhabi that culture is the backbone of our society.
Stay tuned for a special episode of the show, in which you can hear His Excellency Mohammed Khalifa Al Mubarak explain exactly why and how Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is the perfect place to collaborate, create and innovate. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up, a very special live edition of the show recorded at the headquarters of French sustainable construction specialists, Saint-Gobain. Our setting was the top floor atrium of Saint-Gobain's state-of-the-art tower in the heart of Paris's La Défense, designed to offer Saint-Gobain employees the same sort of considered and considerate building that they provide to their customers. Joining myself and Monocle's design editor, Nick Manise, were Pascal Eveillard, Director of Sustainable Business Development at Saint-Gobain, Petra Marko, architect, placemaker and author of Meanwhile City, a guide for how temporary interventions can help shape urban identity, and Kelsea Crawford, architect and co-founder of Cutwork Studio, an architecture practice specialised in building new ways to live and work in cities. All that coming up over the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist. Now let's join our conversation from the Saint-Gobain Tower. I want to talk first about community. Pascal, it's great to hear about extraordinary buildings being made, but I guess it's only what happens once you get inside them that matters. You have to make buildings that people want to be in, where people want to hang out with each other. Pascal looks after sustainability and sustainability for Saint-Gobain. But I presume that sustainability doesn't really mean anything if people don't want to be in these buildings, don't want to be part of a community. Is thinking about the people as much as a part of the process as about the filling out the charts and making sure you're hitting the CO2 emission targets?
For Saint-Gobain, sustainability is about reducing the footprint of buildings and of the built environment on the planet, while also enhancing people's health and well-being. For us, it's not a trade-off between people feeling better, working in better environment, in less impacting environment, or having better living conditions. It's both. And if we want to make sustainability appealing for people, we shouldn't forget these people aspects. And for Saint-Gobain, in this tower, it was a challenge to build low carbon, to build more circular, but in the same time, we engage a lot by having employees in working groups very early in the design process to think together on the way to work and about what would make working in this tower something very special, unique for the employees. So taking care from the design stage, from the very early stage, of what people will do in a building, if a school, if an office building, a commercial building or whatever, is key. And if we want to succeed in the transformation of the built environment, and we have seen it recently during the elections, greening the world is less of appealing for many people. And the Green Deal in Europe started to be a bit criticized. People don't understand, forget about the target, why we are going for less impacting things. So if we want people to embark people, I think it's key that we insist more than we do today on the people side of sustainability. We are working to make great places for people to live in.
So explaining the benefits as well as the punishment side of it. Because
Absolutely.
people often just see that
it's not a punishment, it's a reward to live, to work, to study in a more sustainable building.
So we walked around here, the people who did the tour, and there's nice cool air and the glass is good at filtering the sun. But again, it only means something if people say, don't know why, I just like going to the office. It's a nice environment to be in. This is the payoff.
It's a nice environment to be in. It's attractive, but it's also designed for different configurations. You have been through different floors. I don't know if you have noticed that each floor is different. People have been involved in designing the layout for the different floors. So working in my team in sustainability on the 25th looks different from working on the other floors, because the way we want it to be is different from the way other departments want it to be.
So it's about buy-in. It's having people buy into these places where they're
absolutely
working,
to
living.
feel home, even at work.
I mean, maybe this is a nice chance to bring you in here, Petra. I mean, you do a lot of work, or have done a lot of work around, I guess, activations, trying to bring life and a sense of place back to spaces in our cities. Are there any sort of lessons you've picked up, maybe writing Meanwhile City, your book, that you've observed? You know, you've gone and retrofitted a place, but how could we have pulled these lessons in more permanently earlier in a project?
I think what we actually start to talk about here is developing relationship to place. So kind of having a sense of ownership and a sense of relationship to the place, which means that if I take care about my street, about my neighborhood, then I will also behave in a certain way. Maybe don't throw litter. Maybe I will be more, friendly to the neighbors. And I think this comes with giving people a sense of agency. Let's say one of the examples in the book is about a city-led program in Vienna, which is for residents to create parklets on their street. And Grezoase in Vienna actually invites people who on their doorstep want to transform a parking place into a parklet, so like a space for seating with some planting and so on. And they get a little help from the city, they get some financial help, and they get the base for it. But it's up to them to propose the project. And actually, it became very, very popular. So they've supported over 500 of those across Vienna, which shows you how beautiful a very, very simple, small thing is, where actually people can come together in a neighborhood. It had provided more outdoor spaces for socializing for people during COVID. During COVID, those parklets had stayed over winter as well. Otherwise, before they were sort of taken indoors over the winter. And it's a very simple thing that can be actually scaled up across neighborhoods. And in one of the neighborhoods in Vienna, they, off the back of the Grezoase initiative, started to shape, and now they have implemented the so-called Super Grätzel, which combines the parklets, the Grezoase, with the idea of super blocks from Barcelona. And actually, we visited it recently with my colleagues, and it's amazing to see how people had really taken ownership of that transformation. It had been driven bottom up, but it was supported from top down through the city program. So I think that's both ways. And what we were talking about with the building here, obviously it's a huge tower. It can't be built bottom up by the people, but involving them early on in the process and shaping the space gives them that sense of ownership.
Kelsea, you work in the world of co-living. You're producing buildings all around the world, from Saudi to Dubai to Paris. Community must be integral, because again, those buildings only work if people come together as a community.
Just reflecting on what you've been sharing, I think one of the things I find really interesting about building, and if we think about a building such as this, there's very few innovations that have changed the landscape of the city more than the elevator. And we often say in our studio, if the challenge of the last century was to densify vertically, the challenge of the next century is to understand how to become more elastic in the usages which we have. So looking at how spaces can be thought of from the very origin with people in mind, and how a space can be used in its multiplicity, how it can be used in daytime or in nighttime in a different way, how it can cater to a range of different audiences instead of being so siloed into what we think this is. And is this a hotel? Is it a residential? Is it a commercial space? Is it a workspace? And I think just what you've said, every space is different, but I think we can go even deeper into understanding how our spaces can be more adaptable and polyvalent, and co-living is a lot of exploration like that. It's understanding that the way people are living are changing, the way work is evolving is changing, and nothing is changing our landscape more than, I don't have one with me, but our cell phones and our laptops, making it possible that this could be my office. I think when we think about sustainability, there's sustainability across a whole palette. And I think one of the big things is looking at how we use space and can be more effective in the space that we already have.
Because you mentioned elasticity there, but we're talking about structures that are very much permanent. How do you reconcile those two differences? How do you create an elastic space that's also a building that, if we're talking sustainability, we want it to be something that's around for 60, 100 years?
I think that the two can go together very well. I think the bottom line is we need a building that's going to last, and we need a building that's going to fulfill its use case. I think the use cases are just evolving very quickly, and we're becoming much more flexible in how we use space, and spaces that don't adapt become graveyards. I mean, we see commercial office space today. We see most hotels. You enter a hotel lobby, and in the majority of them, no one's doing anything interesting. But when you can think of this from the beginning as an operator of how can I activate this space, whether it's for profit or whether it's just to integrate a community feeling or to create a more porous structure so that you create a neighborhood space also. I think the way that big commercial spaces, residential real estate has been thought of is let's build the box and see who comes. And I think that more than ever today, we need to think about who's inside, what they need to do, and it shapes from the beginning of the design process what we're building and how.
I just wanted to jump in there to say that also looking into the future, that's definitely really, really important. But looking to the past, because we have so many buildings in cities that had been around for 50, 70, 40 years, and their function is obsolete now. So reuse and adaptation of those existing buildings and seeing how they can be brought back to life. And there's wonderful examples all around the world about those. But I think, my favorite ones are the ones that are really taking really basic infrastructure, like a multi-story garage in south of London, Peckham Levels, which a 7-story garage had been turned into co-working and ateliers and a rooftop with art, and they also have a kindergarten, the community facilities for the people, and it brings together a lot of people to be able to showcase their work, to be able to learn from each other. And then again, coming back to the idea of scaling that, there's an interesting example in Rotterdam where there's an initiative which had transformed 40 existing city-owned buildings into co-working spaces of different topics. And one of them, for example, is from a laundry building, which is now used as a fashion hub, but it's not just for the fashion designers and the fashion shows, but it's also for the people who are making the garments. So it's providing skills locally. So I think there's a lot to be kind of taken out of existing stock and making that work harder and giving it a new life. In Bratislava, where I'm based now, there's a modernist department store which had been empty for 20 years now. It's been appropriated by a series of creative bars and a rooftop with cultural functions. And there's suddenly this new wave, and suddenly it's really popular. Everybody wants to go there. All the young people hang out there. So we see that a lot. I mean, obviously, we can also get then to the topic of gentrification if we are talking about regeneration.
You mentioned a few case studies there. Are there some ingredients that are, I guess, essential to allowing us to give a structure elasticity? Like you mentioned, and maybe this is something that you work on with Saint-Gobain, obviously. What are some of the ingredients you've seen that are sort of critical to ensuring a building can adapt and change?
This is part of what we are seeking for. We want to be a leader in sustainable and light construction. And for us, moving towards light construction is precisely a way to go for more flexible, more adaptable buildings. It's for sure, over time, take an apartment. You start as a couple, you don't need so much space. Then you have children, you need to expand. Then the children will leave. You won't need so much floor, so maybe you will need to reduce the space. So to have flexibility over time, to adapt, to have possibly a switch of spaces between neighbors according to the needs is something that light constructions can afford. You can easily shift away a wall, a partition, push it, replace it, move it. And this is what we are seeking for. So light construction is good for the environment. It's less material, it's less carbon, but it's also a way to introduce flexibility into buildings, flexibility over their lifetime to adapt to the different uses, but also possibly to change the use from residential to non-residential. And this is what we try to promote, and this is clearly part of circularity. If we want to use less resources, we need to be able to renovate buildings, but more importantly, to make them adaptable over time.
I mean, you mentioned neighbours there. Co-living, it's all about essentially living with people, whether that's an extended family or neighbours. Are these discussions you're having in the work that you're doing? Like, how do we ensure that people can, maybe extend their living space? Are these discussions that you're having?
Yeah, for sure. And, when we look at like some of the most inspiring case studies of housing around the world, there's a project called the Tetris project where you can imagine walls as furniture, right? So you suddenly need an extra bedroom for your child. You can have it for a few years, then you extend into, your neighbor's place, or, there's an amazing project in Amsterdam called the 3-Generation House by an architecture studio called Beta. And it's just a very cleverly designed apartment with 2 separate entrances, 3 stories, and the grandparents are on the top floor. The parents are on the middle floor, and then as the children get older, they take over the bottom floor, and they can use it as an Airbnb in the meantime or for friends. So just very cleverly looking at how we can live together, I think. I think the emergence of co-living is also coming today from big evolutions in the family structure. And if we think of where we were 100, 150 years ago, we typically lived in an extended family network. So in a grouping with parents, with grandparents, with aunts and uncles and cousins, and it was mostly a very resilient type of family network. And over the years, I'll do the very extended version, we've gone from this very resilient extended network core to what we call today a mononuclear family, passing by this whole era in the 1960s of a traditional nuclear family, 2 parents, 2 kids. This is the typical housing that we have ingrained in our minds as this should be what modern housing looks like. But the reality is the actual demographic of that is changing very rapidly. And then we see today, looking in 2024, average divorce rates in Europe are 50% across the board. In cities like Luxembourg, it's 89%. Portugal, the predicted divorce among new marriages is 91%. Just stunning. I'm pointing at this because one of the very insidious things that we don't often think about when we think of sustainability in housing is just how dramatically unsustainable the phenomenon of divorce is to the housing market, because suddenly we've gone from 1 family household to now needing 2 to support 1 set of children. 2 sets of expenses divided across 2 working individuals, purchasing power cut in half, 2 spaces which are needed. This is just kind of a quite dramatic part. But then when we think about just the design part, if we have a 50% expected divorce rate for families, why aren't there more options for apartments that accommodate a parent that watches a child 1 week out of 2? That can be reorganized for that space when the child is not there. How do we design spaces for how people are actually living today? And I think that's why we're so interested in co-living as a studio, which, it's becoming quite old hat now. It's got a lot of stereotypes associated with it. But what we find is that it's one of the only sectors in the real estate industry today where there's experimentation and openness happening to looking at how housing is evolving. And it's our hope that co-living is the tip of the iceberg of what will be a larger scale opening and understanding of how housing can be designed more efficiently, more sustainably, not just in materiality, but also in usages, and sort of this pioneering wave of what's to come with housing in the years ahead.
I'm curious as well, we're talking about a lot of things that are changing. Pascal, Saint-Gobain's been around for centuries. What are some of the things that aren't going to change, that are going to stay consistent in our cities? Like, is there something we can latch onto there?
We will need buildings anyway. We will need places to live, to work, to learn. So this is what will remain. I think what will change is the approach we have of buildings, ownership, occupancy. This will change. So today we have a mindset. So I want to become an owner of my home. I want to have a little garden. We have a very fixed idea of what is the role of real estate in our life and what kind of approach we want to have to it. So I think this will remain if we don't show that there can be alternative ways of approaching construction, real estate. I can imagine what you are describing as already some fans. I can imagine also that if you propose this kind of co-living to a majority of people, it might be a bit more than a challenge at the start. So we need also some education, some approach to demonstrate what is feasible, what we can do, what is wishable to move forward. And this is where experiment is very important in the construction sector. We will not change the construction sector overnight. It's very conservative, it's very diffuse, it's a complex decision-making process. So the only way to move forward is to have some experiments, to have some iconic projects where people will be able to see what it means to move forward, to have alternatives, to be more sustainable. And this is where there is a need for collaboration between designers, architects, developers, to think differently, to showcase what being different can mean, and then possibly engage more people into the change.
Does that change country to country as well? Like, surely there's, we're dealing with different cultures, we're dealing with different climates. Like, do we need to be willing to accept that, hey, it's maybe one way over here and a completely different way over there?
For sure. This is what we see in our barometer. So when measuring understanding and approach to sustainability in the built environment, we see strong differences from region to region. But even within one country, you will find some differences. And in Europe, clearly, the way we approach buildings, housing is very different. So everybody in France wants to have its single-family house in the middle of a garden. So this is so much stuck in the collective spirit that it will not be easy to change. Every politician who has tried to project into something different started to step back the next day because everybody reacts very negatively. In Germany, you have already some spaces inside a multi-family house which are shared. Typically, why should I have my own washing machine while it's used only a few hours a week? Having a shared place where you can have 1 or 2 washing machines for everybody is something that exists since decades in Germany. Why not in France? So it's a way maybe to start small, but already to educate people to think differently.
I mean, Kelsea, you're doing some work in the Gulf in Saudi as well, where is it the first co-living project in Saudi that you're working on? I mean, that has got to be a completely foreign sort of concept there. How are you starting to challenge that? Or, because we're talking about having these benchmark projects. How are you, I guess, selling that concept in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think you're completely on it. The concept of housing is different in every country, and an innovative housing product like co-living is very different in every country. But when we think about, like, in the Nordics, this has been around for hundreds of years. It's just called co-housing, or it's packaged differently. And I think that there's a big role to play of governments and of legislation for facilitating housing like this. Like if you're in Switzerland, for example, co-housing is very much supported by the government, so it's much easier to develop co-housing projects. There's some great ones called the Coda, where it's very simple for a grouping of people to come together and collectively buy or build a building. And then in countries like France, it's just next to a nightmare. It's impossible. That's why it doesn't happen. So you see that's the top-down approach.
And you are French now, so you can say that.
Yeah. But in Saudi, it's really interesting. I mean, it's being able to take a building from its social seed and understanding how the building we are designing will help facilitate certain types of social interactions which are otherwise not available is very much more evident in a country where there's no urbanism built to be social. There's very few places to go and meet other people. It's a car-based city. The city of Riyadh is unbelievably car-centric. I mean, you can't even leave your hotel and walk to a coffee shop. You have to get in your car and drive. And it's a city of densification also. So it's a project it's a 20,000-meter tower that we were instructed to build. And we challenged this as a method and proposed what we called a village tower concept. So creating 3 towers instead of 1 that have a shared podium with social spaces throughout the building, on ground floor, on rooftop, throughout the building itself. So I think at least our position on it is also that it's supportive architecture towards a future which is more open, more collaborative, more inclusive. And we're also working on a project in Abu Dhabi, but we're beginning that project. It's a renovation of the port of Abu Dhabi into what's going to be a city for primarily artists, freelancers, digital nomads, very new types of working, and also local entrepreneurs and artisans within Abu Dhabi. And we're starting that project with, months of research, both qualitative and quantitative, around what are the usages of space in the Middle East versus in the West. What is the difference between shared and private space? What are the needs actually? So thankfully with that project, we're given a lot of time and resources to apply the expertise that we've developed in the Western world without just copy-paste and allowing it to have a filter of what's going to work there.
Petra, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I'd like to do a couple of little warm-ups. So just to brief you all, because I didn't do this before, I'm going to ask you what you would do if you were mayor of Paris for the day. So you've got a moment to think of that. Petra, I guess I just wanted to ask, just finally sort of rounding out this point. I mean, Kelsea was talking there about, not just applying, I guess, our Western models to the Gulf. I mean, is there something to be said about these sort of tactical urbanism, these small interventions that we do in cities to sort of test ideas? Is this where they really show their true worth?
It's really interesting because I think even the cultures don't have to be so radically dramatically different, but you really have to actually consider, I mean, in Budapest, it's different to do a school street than it is in Vienna or in Bratislava or in London. So I think there's always working with the local community and with the particular issues that the local community have and bringing them on board with the process, because without their support, you kind of imposing something and it might not work. At the beginning, sometimes you have to do things top down to show the example, and there could be backlash. I mean, the bicycle versus car has been kind of put in this ideological battle, and it needs political support and a vision. And we are in Paris, where the mayor here had really ran with that vision about making Paris more walkable, putting more people on bikes here. And that's very important, because you can really get scared and stop at the first attempt with the tactical urbanism if you get a lot of media backlash. And I think there was even one episode on the Urbanist where you talked about, I think it was Hamburg in Germany, where there was huge opposition. But it's actually, we always have to think like, who's the opposition? It's a small, very loud group of people who have the means and time to actually go against it. Oftentimes, I mean, not always, we can't generalize. But
Petra, you've done this using children to get through tactical urbanism. That overrides some of those problems by focusing on what children need rather than just what the adults want. It seems to be a bit more unifying and shuts down some of the political conversation.
Absolutely. So we've kind of, in Bratislava, the work we're doing there, we've moved away from talking about the car versus cycling or walking. We actually start with children. So we're working with school communities and we're getting them on board, and then actually they influence behavior change in the parents first and the teachers and so on. So the City for Kids program was piloted at 10 schools last year, and now with help of Bloomberg Associates who are advising the city, we are actually scaling up again, and we are kind of, instead of coming to the schools, we are opening an application-based program where schools will have to come to us and say, we really want you to come here and do the play streets, do the engagement with the children. And I talked about giving agency, and some of the ways that we do that is, for example, children for the play street, where they close the street outside of the school and they have this festival. The children are given a pot of money and they decide how they're going to spend it. So that really gets the conversation going. It gives them a lot of responsibility, and they suddenly can actually make this change. And they are not in the shoes of the teachers, but they're the pupils, and they suddenly can make decisions that are affecting the surroundings of their school. So that's very powerful. And then we do, for example, these perceptive walks. So children try to go to school on crutches or in a wheelchair in a group. So they try how it is for people with different ability to move around in their neighborhood. And this really gets them sensitized about the different needs of people, because we're talking about, I mean, Bratislava, this is former Czechoslovakia, now Slovakia, sort of post-communist country, 34 years after the Velvet Revolution. So a big shift from sort of top-down central planning system to a very dynamic capitalistic system, but democratic system. And we need to educate the youngest of our citizens to understand that they can be part of that decision-making process, they can be part of that place-making or place-shaping process, and that's every citizen's responsibility and a chance to influence and shape the city towards what they would also like to see.
Do we want to do Mayor of Paris for the day?
Mayor of Paris.
Is that so? And this is a TV ad spot. You've got 30 seconds to sell it to us. I mean, Petra, are we talking school streets in Paris?
There are already amazing school streets in Paris, and they're permanently pedestrianized, not just temporarily. So I think, it's really hard to think of upping the game in Paris. So because I was talking, I'll let the rest of the panel go first.
I guess if I was the mayor of Paris, I would wish in one day I could wave my legal wand and update building codes and building regulation to match the way that society actually is today. Not even how it's going to be in 10 years, just today would be great. And allow developers and operators and investors to bank into projects where they're actually going to make a difference in how people live, because so often it's just blocked before anything can get started because it's based on code that was written before there were even cars in the city.
Next candidate?
If I was the mayor of Paris, I would think beyond the peripheric. So I would try to have a development model that is inclusive of the close neighborhood, of the suburbs. Today, it's you have Paris and the rest of the world. And clearly, in terms of development, so making it for cycling or without cars, for people coming from outside Paris, it's a nightmare. So I think there is a real need to think also when you have such a large city that is so much connected for millions of people to the suburbs, it's key that your development will be inclusive of the neighborhood and neighbor cities. And you need to explain what you want to do as well and to sell your project. So I would sell my vision of what a city is to the other cities around Paris to make sure that we have a regional approach that can fly and where people will be happy to live and to cross the peripheric without any damage.
So it's communal buy-in, much like you had for this building. Petra, our final candidate.
I would do a festival of water, and it's a cheat, but I would swim in the Seine, but I already was told that the mayor of Paris was going to swim in the Seine, but opened it up across every water place in Paris for free for the day for people to enjoy water activities, whether indoor or outdoor or in the rivers or in lakes, etc. Just celebrate water because it's really precious and we need it to be clean and we need more of it to adapt to the climate.
And that's all from Saint-Gobain's headquarters. My thanks to our generous hosts, as well as our guests, Pascal Eveillard, Petra Marko and Kelsea Crawford. And to my sparring partner, Nick Manise. The Urbanist is produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye. Thank you for listening, City Lovers.